Yashar Roy for the chanting of the Haftarah. Well, I've got good news and bad news. Which do you want to hear first? Okay, I'll start with the bad news. Rabbi Wexler lost his tiles again. I know. What can you do about it? But here's the good news. Our lost and found box is almost empty. It's a good sign that some things have already been found this year. You know, since Rosh Hashanah, I've been thinking about Rabbi Wexler's sermon about what we've lost and how we are found. And today, I'd like to talk about the emotion that wells up between losing and finding. That emotion is grief. We most associate grief with the loss of a loved one. We grieve the death of a parent or a spouse, a brother or a sister, a grandparent, a child, or a dear friend. And while this is the most acute form of grief, we can experience grief for other reasons as well. Back in March, the Harvard Business Review published an article entitled, "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." They interviewed David Kessler, one of the world's foremost experts on grief, and listen to what he said about what we're experiencing at this time. We're feeling a number of different griefs. We feel the world has changed, and it has. We know this is temporary, but it doesn't feel that way. And we realize things will be different. Just as going to the airport is forever different from how it was before 9/11, things will change, and they've already begun changing. The loss of normalcy, the fear of economic toll, the loss of connection. This is hitting us, and we're grieving collectively. We're not used to this kind of collective grief in the air. Is grief the emotion that you've been feeling? Grief for the loss of the way things were, for the freedom to travel, to go out without precautions, to come to shul, to celebrate milestones in person with family and friends. We can also feel grief at the passing of revered public figures. Congressman John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, recent examples. And grief is a powerful emotion. The Talmud says that even the hero can be conquered by grief. And Kessler, in his book on grief, writes, "It's easy to get stuck in your pain and remain bitter, angry, or depressed. Grief grabs your heart and doesn't seem to let go." Yizkor is a time for us to confront our grief. It is time set aside to remember family and friends who have passed on and whom we miss, but whose love, legacy, and lessons we continue to feel. Though we also recite Yizkor on Shmini Atzeret, Passover, and Shavuot, the contemplation of life and death today on Yom Kippur makes Yizkor even more resonant, especially this year, when just since Rosh Hashanah, COVID-19 has claimed the lives of more than 50,000 people around the world and almost 5,000 people in the United States. These deaths have produced profound grief for families and have also contributed to our collective sense of grief. And it's important to acknowledge the difference. The grief we feel at the death of a loved one is much more intense than the grief we feel at the loss of normalcy or connection. Still, both experiences leave us grieving. And grief weighs on us today as we reflect back on the tragedies, the hardships, and the losses of the past year. Here's a powerful story about loss and grief. The novelist Jesmyn Ward lost her husband to COVID-19 earlier this year, and she wrote a moving reflection on their story and her grief in Vanity Fair. In the story, she refers to her husband as my beloved. Listen to how she describes her experience with loss and grief. My beloved died in January. He was a foot taller than me and had large, beautiful dark eyes and dexterous, kind hands. He fixed me breakfast and pots of loose-leaf tea every morning. He cried at both of our children's births, silently, tears glazing his face. Before I drove our children to school in the pale dawn light, he would put both hands on top of his head and dance in the driveway to make the kids laugh. One of my favorite places in the world was beside him, under his warm arm, the color of deep, dark river water. Ward goes on to describe how, in early January, the whole family became sick. They thought it was the flu. They went to an urgent care center and got flu tests. Ward and her children tested positive, but her husband's tests came back inconclusive. They were all sent home with medication. And while Ward and her children began to feel better, her husband got worse. She goes on to describe what happened next. 2 days after our family doctor visit, I walked into my son's room where my beloved lay. He panted, "Can't breathe." I brought him to the emergency room, where after an hour in the waiting room, he was sedated and put on a ventilator. His organs failed, first his kidneys and then his liver. He had a massive infection in his lungs, developed sepsis, and in the end, his great, strong heart could no longer support a body that had turned on him. He coded 8 times. I witnessed the doctors perform CPR and bring him back 4. Within 15 hours of walking into the emergency room of that hospital, he was dead. The official reason? Acute respiratory distress syndrome. He was 33 years old. And without his arm around my shoulders to shore me up, I sank into hot, wordless grief. It's a heartbreaking story, and one that too many families have had to endure this year. COVID-19, cancer, heart attacks, aneurysms. Each of these causes of death are different, but the outcome is the same: loss, tears, emptiness, grief. Ward goes on to describe this feeling. The absence of my beloved echoed in every room of our house. Him folding me and the children in his arms on our monstrous fake suede sofa. Him shredding chicken for enchiladas in the kitchen. Him holding our daughter by the hands and pulling her upwards higher and higher so she floated at the top of her leap in a long bed-jumping marathon. How does Jesmyn Ward confront her grief? By returning to her work, her writing. Even in a pandemic, even in grief, she writes, I found myself commanded to amplify the voices of the dead that sing to me. Ward is moving through her grief by doing what is meaningful to her, writing. And she goes on to write how George Floyd's dying words, I can't breathe, intersected with her husband's words before he died. The marching for racial justice and the hope that we might actually be able to move closer to it this time also help mitigate her grief. Ward's emotional and heart-rending description of the loss of her husband can serve as a model for how we deal with grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously identified 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These stages were not intended to be prescriptive, rather to describe a general nonlinear process that we go through when we grieve. David Kessler adds a 6th stage, finding meaning, which, he writes, allows us to transform grief into something else, something rich and fulfilling. Though we can move through this process of grief, it never really goes away. There will always be moments, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, special occasions, when that feeling of absence bubbles back up. And once again, we recognize grief. When does this happen for you? Whom do you remember? What is the grief that you are feeling today at Yizkor? Rabbi Lindemann shared with me a cute article about a woman who decided to put her affairs in order so her children wouldn't be overburdened after her death. She created a spreadsheet on her computer listing all her assets, her house, savings accounts, retirement accounts, and she added a where to find section for important things like the key to the safety deposit box, her insurance records, and her will. She also wrote letters to each of her children, expressing her love for them and reminding them of Mom's maxims: wear your seatbelt and don't forget to vote. Once she was all finished, she faced a dilemma. What should she name this file? Her first thought was Dead Parents File, but she quickly realized that was too direct. If I should die and passed on seemed too whimsical, and ex-parents files just didn't sound right. Finally, she realized what she should call it. She moved the cursor to the new folder field and entered its name: Good Grief. Good grief. That's what our Jewish tradition tries to guide us towards after a loss. In his book on Jewish mourning, Ron Wolfson writes that grieving is the way we mend broken hearts. He goes on to show how the Jewish laws of mourning mirror the stages of grief. It begins with shock. Even if you intellectually know that the end is near, when it actually comes, it is very hard to be emotionally prepared for it. It is hard to believe that a father, a mother, a brother, a sister is really gone. Even if they are on hospice, even if it was the end of a long ordeal, it is still hard to accept that they have departed from this world. With this feeling of shock can come a sense of numbness, an outer body type experience, where it can feel like you are watching yourself in a movie. It doesn't seem real. In Judaism, from the moment of death until the funeral is a period called aninut. During this time, the family's main responsibility is to prepare for the funeral and the burial. The order of planning is meant to counter the chaos of loss, and it allows the grieving process to begin. Once the funeral and burial are complete, the next stage is avelut, mourning. It begins with Shiva, the 7-day period which often involves a roller coaster of emotions. Sadness, anger, guilt, longing, and other emotions define our grief. Comforters come in person or virtually to share stories, memories, and lessons to honor the memory of the deceased and to provide solace. And there is food, so much food. But that's because food is love, and that too is meant to bring comfort. And when Shiva ends, our grief does not end with it. There is no timetable for the healing of the human heart. Each person heals differently. That's why after Shiva there is Shloshim, the 30-day period where we continue to say Mourner's Kaddish and express our grief while trying to adjust to the new normal, to life with someone missing. When mourning a parent, we continue to say Kaddish for 11 months, emphasizing the unique relationship that children have with parents. And at the conclusion of the first year, and every anniversary thereafter, there is Yartzeit, where we come to shul to say Mourner's Kaddish, light a memorial candle, and give tzedakah. And of course, there is Yizkor. This entire process of mourning helps us move through our grief. And for some, it works. I have sat with many of you at a moment of loss. At a bedside surrounded by family, as we have said vidui, the confessional prayer that we say at the end of life. This is the most difficult part of being a rabbi, but also the greatest privilege, to be there with you, or to get that phone call when a spouse, a child, or a loved one passes on. When you lose a loved one, we share in your grief. And this year, the COVID-19 restrictions has often made being there at the end of life impossible. And not being able to be together at the bedside, at the funeral for Shiva, can make a loss feel unbearable. Even if we haven't had the experience of losing a loved one during this time, the enormity of the losses weigh on us. It makes us all feel grief. In the Yizkor book, I shared a letter from Sigmund Freud, who reflected on the loss of his daughter, Sophie, during the Spanish flu pandemic in 1920. Listen to how he described receiving the news. That afternoon, we received the news that our sweet Sophie in Hamburg had been snatched away by influenza pneumonia, snatched away in the midst of glowing health, from a full and active life as a competent mother and loving wife, all in 4 or 5 days, as though she had never existed. Although we had been worried about her for a couple of days, we had nevertheless been hopeful. It is so difficult to judge from a distance. And this distance must remain distance. We were not able to travel at once as we intended after the first alarming news, for there was no train, not even for an emergency. The undisguised brutality of our time is weighing heavily upon us. The undisguised brutality of our time is weighing heavily upon us this year. Do you feel it? So many tragic stories, so many terrible losses, so much grief that we're all carrying. How do we carry this grief? And how do we move through it? There is an old Chinese legend about a woman whose only son died. In her grief, she went to a holy man and asked, "What prayers, what magical incantations do you have to bring my son back to life?" The holy man said, "Fetch me a mustard seed from a home that has never known sorrow, and we will use it to bring you comfort." So the woman set off at once in search of this magical mustard seed. She came first to a beautiful mansion, knocked at the door and said, "I'm looking for a home that has never known sorrow. Is this such a place?" They told her, "You've certainly come to the wrong house." And they went on to describe all the tragic things that had befallen them. The woman said to herself, "Who better to keep these poor people than I, who have had misfortunes of my own?" So she stayed to comfort them for a while, then went on in search of a home that had never known sorrow. But wherever she went, whether hovels or palaces, she found one tale of sadness and loss. Ultimately, this woman became so involved in ministering to other people's grief that she forgot about her quest for the magical mustard seed. The holy man had been right. Her quest for the mustard seed did bring her comfort, and it also enabled her to bring comfort to others. Jesmyn Ward wrote through her grief, and this brought her meaning and no doubt brought comfort to her readers. There are other examples of people finding purpose in their grief. Candy Lightner founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving in 1980 after her daughter, Carrie, was killed by a repeat drunk driving offender. Though she said she never understood why her daughter died, she found great meaning in forming a group that saved the lives of others. And that book about grief I cited earlier by David Kessler was partly the result of coping with the grief after the tragic death of his 20-year-old son to a drug overdose. Grief can be all-consuming, or it can be accepted, and the losses can be honored when we find ways to live with greater purpose and meaning. This is what we commit to in our Yizkor prayers, which we will turn to shortly. For each person we remember, we say, Hineni nodev or nodevet tzedakah. I pledge tzedakah, to perform acts of charity and goodness, to perpetuate the ideals important to my father, my mother, my partner, my child, my grandparent, my friend. For Judaism, remembering isn't only recalling fond moments with loved ones. Remembering is recommitting ourselves to live by their values. It is pledging to honor them by making a difference in the world, which will hopefully inspire our children and grandchildren to do the same when our time comes. This is how we pass on our traditions. This is how we honor those whom we remember today. We promise to make them proud. We promise to make a better world. And this teaches us the most important lesson about grief. Grief and love are inextricably intertwined. We feel grief because we felt love. Even in our grief, we know that our love endures well beyond this world. It transcends this world. And we continue to show our love by living out the values of those we recall today. And now it's time to remember and to find meaning in our grief as we turn to Yizkor. Page 569 in our Machzorim. We rise.